Hi, good afternoon. I'm Jason Marzak, Director of the Asian Arts Latin America Center at the Atlantic Council. Thank you so much for being with us today for this discussion in partnership with the Atlantic Council's Iraq Initiative, perhaps one of the first programs with our Iraq Initiative that we've done with the Asian Arts Latin America Center to explore humanitarian frameworks for Venezuela and analyze lessons learned from one particular global experience, Iraq's Oil for Food program. This event will be held both in English and in Spanish with interpretation. So for those who are joining via the Zoom platform, that interpretation button is at the bottom of your screen. You can also follow the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag ACVenezuela. Now, on Friday, as all of you know, members of the Venezuelan opposition and representatives of Nicolas Maduro will meet in Mexico to kick off a new round of negotiations mediated by Norway. As these negotiations on Venezuela's political and electoral future begin, it's also simultaneously important to consider pathways for expanded and more effective humanitarian assistance. And we know there is broad support among key constituencies, especially in the key state of Florida for this. At the Atlantic Council, we did a poll earlier this year where we found that while 89% of respondents believe Nicolas Maduro was responsible for causing the humanitarian emergency in Venezuela, 65% believe that more humanitarian assistance should be provided to address the complex humanitarian emergency in the country, regardless of whether Maduro remains in power or not. Now, effectively mitigating the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, the worst in the Western Hemisphere's modern history, is of course a daunting task. But historical experiences from Iraq to Kazakhstan offer insight into what does not work and what could work through a non-conventional humanitarian mechanism that uses Venezuela's crude oil sales for humanitarian purposes. Now, the first half of today's discussion will focus on the 1996 to 2003 UN Oil for Food program in Iraq, with an eye toward the lessons that it offers as we look at humanitarian frameworks for Venezuela. And how can the role of the United States, the international community, and oil industry companies in the Iraq experience be applied to present-day Venezuela? Any humanitarian framework, especially in a politically fraught and economically devastated country like Venezuela, must guarantee mechanisms to ensure transparency and accountability through all its stages, including financing and revenue management, governance structures, the role of oil producers and operators, and humanitarian delivery and impact. But none of these stages can take place without a political agreement between Venezuela's opposition and Maduro within the framework of US sanctions. This is what we want to highlight as we navigate through Iraq's program and analyze what must be avoided and also what could be applied for Venezuela. Today's discussion is going to help to inform an upcoming Atlantic Council policy brief on this issue that will provide analysis on how the Iraq program and current humanitarian proposals for Venezuela could become politically viable in a humanitarian framework that is effective and transparent. This event is part of the Asian Arts Latin America Center's Venezuela Working Group that seeks to unpack and analyze humanitarian proposals that leverage oil revenues to purchase humanitarian assistance. Now, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, our Venezuela Working Group is a high-level group that informs policymakers in the United States and Europe and in Latin America on how to restore democracy in Venezuela through a sustained human-centered international campaign that advances an inclusive Venezuela-led resolution to the crisis. And at the Atlantic Council, we will continue to bring together a diversity of voices from different ideologies and political backgrounds to help build a sustainable vision for Venezuela that is grounded in durable solutions for the Venezuelan people, those people who are in fact the ones who are suffering the most from this protracted crisis. So with that, I'd like to introduce the first speakers who will join for a 30-minute conversation on the Iraq program and lessons for Venezuela. And after that, Diego Area will moderate a second conversation on the applicability for Venezuela and also look at other humanitarian proposals. First, Ambassador Chris Hill. Welcome. Ambassador Hill served as the U.S. Ambassador to Iraq from 2009 to 2010. He's also an adjunct professor at Columbia University. Welcome, Ambassador Hill. So great that you could join us. Also joining in this first panel is Hagar Shamali. Hagar was a senior policy advisor on Asia and Middle East policy in the Office of Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes. and is a sanctions expert with the Atlantic Council's Economic Sanctions Initiative in our Geoeconomic Center. And then we're also joined by Abbas Kadhim. Abbas is the director of the Atlantic Council's Iraq Initiative and one of the foremost experts on his native country. With that, I'd like to kick it off with a first question to you, Ambassador Hill. I'd like to begin looking a little bit back at the Oil for Food program. 2 years after the Oil for Food program ended, as you're very familiar with, the UN Independent Inquiry Committee and a separate CIA investigation found that during the humanitarian program, the UN allowed Saddam Hussein to line his pockets with over $12 billion in kickbacks and surcharges and illegal oil smuggling. And to kick off this conversation, Ambassador Hill, mismanagement and also poor oversight of oil sales and transactions, and they played the program with this graft. And from your perspective, what can this program tell us about other possible humanitarian frameworks for crisis-stricken and sanctioned countries such as Venezuela?
Well, first of all, let me just commend the Atlantic Council's Latin American Center for trying to look at past models and see the applicability of these models. It was obviously a very tough situation, especially the humanitarian situation. I mean, you don't have to be in neighboring Colombia to realize what a catastrophe the Venezuelan economy has been. I must say, when I recall looking at this Oil for Food program and recall the elements of it, it was the first word that comes to my mind is just the utter complexity of the program. I mean, the efforts to try to square a circle that was not going to be very easy to do. I mean, first of all, you have a system, and I think it's fair to say that apply this to Saddam Hussein's regime, where the institutions, such as they were, had been pretty much destroyed. So when you look at a complex program like this, you're asking institutions that have not functioned as institutions in years to essentially play a central role in it. So I think you're putting a great strain on precisely what you need to rely on, which is the various institutions. Secondly, I can't speak to the Maduro government, but I can certainly comment on the Saddam Hussein government, which was that it was extremely cynical, and it looked to use any program to kind of undermine the deliverers of that program. It's no coincidence, it's no secret why the UN was really kind of raked over the coals on this one. It had to do a lot with the cynicism and the duplicity of the Saddam Hussein regime in implementing it. Thirdly, again, going back to the institutions in question, you have a situation, and you have this in any kind of sanctions mitigation, where you create new economic elites. And some of these economic elites were rather frightening. The people who were able to make money from this, and the sort of overall sense that injustice was now not only going to be administered by the Saddam Hussein regime, but would now have a co-conspirator in it, and that was the UN. So it was a program that I think probably did more to undermine the reputation of the UN at the time, which was already being hit hard by the whole issue of verification of the WMD program. But I think the UN came out of this much the worse for where it was. I think, again, not to repeat myself, but yeah. I think when you have programs like this, you have real issues in the capacity of an international organization to come in, to understand the system, to try to create a kind of playing field where indeed you're helping the people who need to be helped. And I think it's extremely challenging in countries that I think approach the status of failed states. So with those as sort of
Yeah, that's really helpful, Ambassador Hill. Maybe a quick follow-up. So I'm looking at your overall framework of what does this program tell us? What are the lessons of this program? The utter complexity. The program relied on institutions that were failed institutions. Dealt with a leader who was cynical and was seeking to undermine the program wherever he could. And then this whole class of economic elites. So from your perspective, when looking at those many challenges, what does that say for other crisis-stricken and sanctioned countries around the world? What are some of the lessons from those three nuggets that you just put out there insofar as the main elements of the program?
Well, the best programs are the ones that are kept simple. The best programs are the ones that have sort of direct ties to the people you're trying to help. This was a bit of a carom shot. I mean, you're trying to get oil from, in this case, from Iraq. You're trying to ensure that the proceeds of it go to the right people, et cetera. By the way, there are other things going on there too. There was an effort to address the Kuwait reparations, as if this wasn't complicated enough. They wanted to bring this in. So I think the old adage of keep it simple is probably the most important thing. And in simplicity, you often go to complexity in a hurry. But I think the problem was there was so much skepticism about it in the first place that they tried to overload it with systems that were to show that they were addressing, the perfidy of the Saddam Hussein regime. And in so doing, I think kind of made it even more unlikely that they could target the people who really needed the program.
Thanks, Ambassador. That's really great insight. I want to move on to Abbas, and feel free, Abbas, to comment on the ambassador's perspectives. But also, I want to ask you, looking back at the Iraq welfare program, it was established, of course, following the Gulf War, a time of incredible political instability and of course, humanitarian suffering in Iraq. How did the political agreements for that program come about, both in the Security Council and with the Hussein regime? And then also, Abbas, what are some of the lessons learned for any country today, especially one with both an authoritarian leader like Venezuela and also a humanitarian crisis, in which such a program is being considered? So, how did those agreements come about, and what are some of the what are the lessons learned for a country like Venezuela today?
Thank you, Jason, for having me, and thanks for to the Latin America program at the Atlantic Council. It's a privilege to cooperate with you on this important panel. Very little can be added to the way Ambassador Hill articulated the issues that he addressed. The program itself, of course, started initially after complete sanctions on Saddam Hussein, and as the pain and suffering of the Iraqi people became embarrassing for the powers that applied that sanction system, and Saddam Hussein effectively used it to mobilize the world sentiment against the sanctions. Then there was this idea that, okay, why don't we relieve the Iraqis of some of this pain and suffering? Saddam initially refused any offer to trade oil for food. Then, because of the crippling economic sanctions and also the challenges that he was facing, Iraq was completely dependent on oil. He agreed later on to work that, but only after he put in place the measures that Ambassador Hill was just talking about. The system itself piled an international corruption at great magnitude over the domestic corruption that was already existing in Iraq. Just to give nuances to what the corruption that the ambassador was talking about, out of the 4,500 companies that dealt with the program, half of them, that's more than 2,250 companies, were involved, according to credible audits, they were involved in kickbacks, bribes, overcharging, and all other things. Also, the audits, again, that were done found corruption throughout the system of the UN, all the way up to the families of secretary generals. They said the secretary generals themselves were not involved, but certainly credible charges or accusations of their own family members to benefit from this. And also putting the dictator himself, Saddam Hussein, in charge. He used that as a weapon to punish his domestic opponents and also reward his own followers and loyalists, and purchase more loyalty, bribe the people through this their food and their medicine. And that was another the lack of control over where the food goes and who gets it and who doesn't, and the medicine became another added suffering. And that's another problem altogether we could talk about. And Saddam Hussein, of course, throughout that time, he managed to take billions of dollars and build palaces and do all the things. In other words, the people suffered, but the dictator thrived. And also he managed to blame all of his incompetence and his own atrocities on the international community and also the countries that were more involved, the United States, Britain, etc. And that mobilized the people emotionally against the West, because at the end of the day, they were the ones who had that. The complexity of the program also is another layer of it. In order to purchase anything, even through the oil for food program, you had to go through committees and committees and committees, to the point where they prevented Iraqis from even importing simple things like pencils, because they considered them to be dual use and Saddam could use them for weapons of mass destruction. It was that intrusive and cumbersome. The idea of course, criticizing the oil for food program, which became the textbook of what not to do, is not to undermine or underestimate the importance of democracy for any country that is being pressured. But I think the tools that are used, sanctions, it is a wicked program inherently, and it cannot be run well. That is the problem with it. And I think as an Iraqi and someone who is close to the Iraqis, studied it and saw the suffering of my own family members and many friends and all of the other Iraqis, as we see the consequences and the demoralization and irreversible change of the Iraqi moral system because of the sanctions. And we don't wish them on any people, on any country. One last statement basically is to say, with Iraq, the irony is that even with the pain of suffering, 11 years of unnecessary pain for the Iraqi people, the sanctions were not what provided solution for Iraq, but an invasion, which could have been done really in 1991. And it's then all of that would be over with. So it's just an added unnecessary 11 years of sanctions and pain.
So Abbas, a couple key points you mentioned. Hussein used the sanctions as a weapon. The proliferation of kickbacks and corruption as part of the Iraq Oil for Food program, and also the distribution of food and medicine being used as a weapon as well, and as a control mechanism with the Iraqi population, and also reinforcing the Ambassador Hill's comments on the many challenges with the complexity of the program. So those are all important lessons to take from the Iraq program when thinking about applicability of it and what to avoid when thinking about other international humanitarian frameworks. Hagar, I want to move to you as a sanctions expert with expertise in Middle East foreign policy. I'd like to get your thoughts on how the Oil for Food program was designed to operate within a framework of sanctions. The ambassador and Abbas have both been speaking about the sanctions. How did the sanctions that were imposed on Iraq compared to the current economic sanctions against the Maduro regime in Venezuela? And I think having that comparative framework with the two different sanctions regimes is helpful for them to understand the applicability of some of the lessons from the Iraq program.
I'm so glad you took it down that road, because that's kind of where I wanted to take the conversation following Abbas's comments. First, thank you for having me here. I'm so glad to be here. And I'll start off with noting first that I agree with all of the ambassador's comments. regarding the Oil for Food program. I started my career in government with my congressman from Connecticut, Chris Shays, who felt very deeply about Iraq and had several hearings on the Oil for Food program that I helped with. And we really saw nothing but problem after problem. And so in the sanctions world, I've really rarely, if ever, heard anybody look back to the Oil for Food program as a potential model to emulate, even if you could rid itself of the corruption, of the cynical government, of these leaders. And the reason for that is not just because it was fraught with so many problems, but also because often if you need a program of this kind, it means that the government on the other end, the government that's being heavily sanctioned, is in and of itself probably not very friendly to its own people, probably riddled with corruption, and obviously engaged in a range of objectionable or criminal behavior. So this is just to start off. When Abbas was talking about the sanctions that he and his family suffered under in Iraq, and what he's describing sounds very similar. Very similar to what you hear for what are known as countrywide embargoes. And we don't really use countrywide embargoes anymore. Technically, we have one against Cuba that remains as an antiquated program, as I'm sure you all know, that was established by the US Congress. And otherwise, we have sanctions regimes that sometimes are so heavy, like the Iranian one, for example, that it comes close to a countrywide embargo. But we have really, since September 11 in particular, strayed away from the countrywide embargo systems because the only one in history that really seemed to work was the one in South Africa that was applied against the apartheid regime. That's really the only one. Countrywide embargoes really do hurt the population. There's greater collateral damage there. And so that's really not what you have in Venezuela. That's not to say the sanctions aren't strong for Venezuela, but that's not at all the system that you have. What you have in Venezuela is sanctions focus on three areas. The first is, dating to the Trump administration, which their stated objective was regime change, right? They recognized the leader of the opposition and the House, Juan Guaido, and they sanctioned Nicolas Maduro himself and the central bank of Venezuela, and then numerous others, right? So one was to get at the leadership and the regime, one bucket of sanctions. The second bucket of sanctions was to get at corruption in Venezuela and how those political elites benefited themselves financially from things like the oil in particular. That's why PDVSA was targeted, at least that's what was said. And then the third bucket was to target Venezuela's human rights abuses and repression of its own people. So you have these three buckets, right? And so this system is very similar to the sanctions regimes you saw after September 11, which we used to call, what we still call, targeted financial measures. And the difference between that and the countrywide embargoes is that they are meant to target, or they are meant to inflict some kind of pain on the intended target. So you're going to see specific individuals named, you're going to see specific agencies or government agencies or companies, so on, named. And that's what you saw for Venezuela. Now, admittedly, as somebody who worked in sanctions a very long time, I can tell you I was myself a little bit surprised as to how fast it went. It really ramped from like 0 to 60, mostly under the Trump administration. I've not seen much toward Venezuela under the Biden administration. I think they're still figuring out what to do, how to approach that. I don't think regime change is in the cards for them, but I certainly think that they would like to continue undermining the Maduro government. But when you think of an oil for food program, and you think of Venezuela, and for example, you look at PDVSA, when Treasury sanctioned PDVSA in 2019, in the press release, it is stated that one of the reasons they did it was because the government elites were themselves directly, personally benefiting off of the oil proceeds, right? Off of the sale of this oil. So they're targeting corruption in this regard. And the problem with that is that they're highlighting this behavior altogether. So if you fabricate a system that's like the oil for food, it's hard to see how it could work if you've got a government that doesn't really seem to have an interest in helping its own people anyway, and or being incentivized.
So Hagar, looking at the parallels with Iraq, right?
Yeah.
So in Iraq as well, you had a government, of course, that wasn't interested in helping its people. So what is the sanctions and the Biden administration has been looking at kind of a review of the current sanctions and has insofar as making sure that our sanctions policy has more of a scalpel than a hatchet approach to make sure that the Venezuelan people are not suffering because of sanctions. But what is from your perspective, what does the sanctions that were levied on Iraq at the time, insofar as kind of how are those different from what's in Venezuela today, and does that offer any guidance for then possible humanitarian frameworks?
I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer this in the way that you're looking for an answer, because the sanctions against Iraq at the time in the 90s were just completely different. These were countrywide embargoes prohibiting trade, right? That's very different than a sanction where you are freezing assets within the US jurisdiction and prohibiting US persons from doing business with an intended target. And that's how sanctions generally are pursued now. The thing that, and I don't mean to open a can of worms here, but the thing that I would encourage the Venezuela working group to look at is, and it's not a perfect model, and no model is going to be perfect. I'm going to say that now, right, with this very humanitarian effort. But the Iran sanctions, where countries that imported Iranian oil were required to keep those proceeds in a bank account abroad in South Korea, in India, and China, and so on. And then those proceeds could only be used to purchase food and medicine and then exported back to Iran, right? That system is something I see as a bit more realistic. Now, we're a little bit far from that because you don't have these wide secondary sanctions on Venezuela,
Right.
But that's kind of where I would see it going.
That's very helpful.
The oil for food system.
That's very helpful. And I think you did answer the question so far as how the different nature of the sanctions that were imposed on Iraq at the time versus the sanctions that are on Venezuela. I want to move back to you, Ambassador Hill. As we've been discussing, and as you also referenced in your first comments, the Oil for Food program is seen today as offering many lessons of frankly, what not to do, especially given the level of corruption that took place. So my question for you is, what advice, maybe in terms of messaging or framing, would you give to political actors that are working to alleviate Venezuela's humanitarian crisis, who are trying to find a humanitarian framework to help the Venezuelan people, but where the failures of Iraq's program is frankly front and center for many in the international community?
Well, I think one has to be realistic about the fact that if you go the route of sanctions, and sanctions are often a weapon that you can't ignore. There's a lot of pressure from Congress for sanctions. It's something where if the alternative is to do nothing, you have to have some kind of sanctions program. But I think there has to be an appreciation for the fact that, show me a sanctions program and I'm going to show you some unintended victims of that sanctions program. So that is, just has to be understood. I think you can fine tune these things. I like the idea that if you're going to go ahead and buy oil, the oil somehow should be put in some kind of, or the proceeds, if you can put that into some kind of escrow. Again, though, I think ultimately you have to be realistic about what the victims are and then set up a program, whether it's food on the border, whether it's some kind of capacity to use institutions, whether it's some kind of church groups or, whatever there is of civil society, religious groups, to try to get help to those people who are going to be affected. And by the way, I don't like to see sanctions as a sort of permanent solution to everything, except as if to say, well, what do you mean we don't have a program to seek political change? We have a sanctions program. I think countries, if you want to make a change, I think you've got to make it a priority. And I'm not necessarily suggesting military, but I think there has to be a pretty high priority in any administration to go after the objectives that you want. and not just say, well, we've ticked the box by having a sanctions program and leave it forever or leave it for a long time. There's no question the UN came out the worse for wear in this, and it's just not fair to the UN. It was frankly the member states who did this to the UN. So I think we've got to understand that sanctions are, as Clausewitz once said about war, sanctions are a serious means to a serious end. And you better be serious about what you're doing, and don't think you can just kind of park it in a sanctions regime and let that go on forever and then be surprised that you have a lot of unintended victims.
Really great points. I think one thing I wrote down, realistic expectations. And maybe ambassadors were looking back at the Iraq program, maybe there were unrealistic expectations from the get-go insofar as what it was seeking to accomplish. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but and also kind of the use of civil society. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, just to reiterate, there's a tremendous political pressure to do something. And the something is usually not to drop bombs. I mean, that's a pretty serious approach. So often people kind of look for something in between, and sanctions are it. But I think there has to be a greater appreciation for the fact that they're not going to be effective in the short run. And so you need a political program that kind of steps up the pace of change and makes this a priority. Because one thing you want to convince country X of is, look, we're going to try to make this, and if sanctions aren't going to work, we'll find something else. You need to make it clear this is a priority. And I think too often it's a secondary crisis and people say, oh, well, let's just put a sanctions regime and say we're doing something. And what you're often doing is creating unintended victims.
And looking back at the experience from Iraq and the comparison to Venezuela today, I think many see sanctions are, of course, not a policy. They're one of the many tools to help to achieve policy objectives, as you're saying. But I think as we're drawing this panel to a close here, the real importance of finding other. You mentioned from the get-go that we relied on failed institutions from the get-go. In Iraq, and as you were just pointing out now, looking at other actors to be significant players in any potential international humanitarian framework for a country. The need to keep it simple, the tendency toward complexity to try to avoid graft and corruption, but in many ways the complexity of the program at the time actually encouraged greater graft and corruption and kickbacks, and also ensuring that any type of humanitarian program doesn't, in the end, just serve to give another tool to an authoritarian leader that the leader can use to be weaponized against his own people. As you've said, and Abbas, you were mentioning as well, specifically your example on even pencils. So I want to we probably could continue this conversation for another 30 minutes. But I want to thank you, Ambassador Hill and Abbas and Hagar, for joining this first conversation, and turn it over to Diego for our second conversation.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you to all the panelists for such an insightful conversation. Now we'll turn to Spanish to speak with members of the Venezuela Working Group about the lessons learned from Iraq's humanitarian program and their applicability to Venezuela. For those who want to keep listening in English, we have an interpretation available for the next conversation. Please click on the interpretation button that appears on the taskbar on the bottom of the Zoom page, and then select your preferred language. Ahora sí, en español, bienvenidos, Tamara Herrera.
Now in Spanish, I would like to extend my welcome to Francisco Monalde, Director and Fellow of the Latin American Initiative, Tamara Herrera, Managing Director and Chief Economist of Síntesis Financiera, Patricia Ventura, Director of Regional Public Affairs and Government Relations from IPD Latin America. I wanted to also thank Leopoldo Martinez, all our members of the Venezuela Working Group. He was appointed by Joe Biden into a group at the IDB. He will be a part of everything we're doing now and in the future. So I'm going to jump into the first question very quickly because we have very little time for our discussion. So let me begin with you, Francisco. The program that we heard discussed, the Oil for Food program in Iraq, is a number of historical cases that could serve as a benchmark for Venezuela, applying what worked and avoiding what did not work. And we know that there were many scandals associated with it. We know that the Venezuelan political context today is very different. The sanctions regime is very different. But I was wondering what the first steps could be at a political level in terms of Venezuela to move forward in this path to sell crude oil to deal with some of the humanitarian assistance needs. So, Francisco, thank you. The previous panel was very helpful. I think it helped us to understand a lot how this would apply to the case of Venezuela. As you were saying, uh, this matter it needs to move in parallel with the negotiations in Mexico, looking at how to move forward with the humanitarian assistance because the situation is so complex. There's great potential for using revenues from oil sales to alleviate some of the humanitarian issues. In terms of US policy, there's this perception that this would be very similar to the program that was used in Iraq, and so it's doomed to fail. Anyone who tries to address these problems might be faced with the same difficulties, but I do believe it's important to move forward with mechanisms within the existing sanction structure from OFAC that enables us to find alternatives so that some Venezuelan oil exports done through Mixta Petrolera, which has international partners, they would export it, put it into some sort of trust account to then fund some of these initiatives that are already underway. For example, COVAX, that vaccine program, as well as UNICEF programs, the the World Food Program, and some of their programs. There are a series of non-governmental organizations working in Venezuela on different initiatives, and we believe that they could receive funding from a program like this. Venezuela's oil sector is key to rebuilding Venezuela. What we've seen happening is that this sector has contracted very significantly, and we've seen Total and some other international companies leave Venezuela. This is going to impact the future of the oil sector. What we have to do is make these projects feasible in such a way that the United States and international communities can assure that the revenues from the oil exports can ultimately benefit the Venezuelan people. This is what we in the group believe could be a solution. So find very specific initiatives within the existing mechanism of licensing and permitting that would help to generate these resources. Thank you, Francisco. I think you responded to one of the concerns expressed in the first panel. They don't want the system to become overly complex because that can lead to graft. But we need to look at what's feasible so that we can move forward. Let's move on to Patricia. Welcome, Patricia. She's been part of the Venezuela Working Group, engaging with different stakeholders, one with the Boston Group, that is a group that serves as a forum for diverse voices from all sectors of the Venezuelan political spectrum. I would like to know what you think are the opportunities and challenges and what's truly feasible in terms of Venezuela. Thank you, Diego, and thank you very much for organizing this event. I'm really pleased to be a part of it. The Boston Group members have been working essentially on a financial mechanism for humanitarian aid through the sale of oil. The proposal from the Boston Group is looking at a monthly fee that would be a part of some sort of joint venture or more than one with the support of the minority shareholders. And then this amount, they would deposit everything having to do with royalties and export costs and fees, with 50% of some of the tax revenues to the Venezuelan government. That would be deposited in a trust fund. And that trust account would be used to cover the purchase of all of the humanitarian aid that Francisco discussed earlier. The Boston Group is suggesting that this trust account be managed by the UN or by one of its agencies through the creation of a council of experts that would, in one way or another, provide advisory services for the project. Nevertheless, it doesn't include any political actor. This means that the two large blocks would support the project. This is where we have to understand a bit better that these types of undertakings require the support of both sides, and that's very difficult to achieve. We're not just talking about what's obvious, the Maduro regime and the other political actors, but also the entire political spectrum. The issue is very complex because the official public data is very general. So we don't know exactly how this proposal would work in the end. But first, you have to look at the exports. There are significant legal hurdles. The law, if you look at joint ventures and synthetic byproducts, those can only be exported. And so we would have to look at what types of joint ventures would be working on this proposal. And then there's something else that's very important, which is volume.
Publicly, the Boston Group has only talked about 200 to 300,000 barrels to be exported monthly, or the equivalent of $50 million. That is a very low amount. It makes no sense from a logistical standpoint, transport standpoint. It would have to be at least 2 million barrels as a minimum, in my view. And also, really important, this hinges on political consensus as well. The PDVSA authorities of the Maduro regime, in their meetings with the Boston Group, have said they're in favor of the proposal, but they favor the Asian market for this framework of humanitarian aid. Thank you, Patricia. In our private conversations, and here it has come up again, we see there are two different avenues that need to work out in parallel. You have the technical operational side of any such program, but then a cross-cutting issue is always the political side, and there are a lot of open questions. How would the decision making and governance process work when you have US sanctions against Venezuelan officials? How would decisions be made in that context? And perhaps that's one of the greatest challenges. Now, I want to turn to Tamara because you're on the ground. in Venezuela. So I wanted to get that focus and talk about the viability of such a humanitarian oil program for Venezuela. What are some of the key considerations for the oil sector and the role of operators, oil operators in that humanitarian setting? Thank you. Thank you for the question. Thank you to the Atlantic Council for holding this event. What's fundamental here is that well, three challenges that have already been highlighted. First, the political challenges of even arriving at an agreement. Second factor is time, which is of the essence. We can't wait for full-fledged political solutions because the humanitarian needs are enormous and immediate. And the other thing that has arisen out of the conversations of the Atlantic Council's Venezuela Working Group is the size of programs. We all agree, especially with the experience of Iraq, that we need to keep it small in terms of the participation of different actors, whether they're civil society or political, and the different parts of this scheme. We have to look at what can be done realistically, urgently. We all agree that in the short term, the money needs to be going where we know that work is being done and has been proven, where there's trust. Francisco mentioned this, such as the World Food Program and what we've done in the COVID emergency. So that goes to the money. As to the operators, Patricia mentioned that the law enables minority shareholders to conduct direct sales, but this does call for a license so that that minority company, and we're thinking of Petropiar, where the Chevron is a minority company. Other companies that are under fuller control of PDVSA. So it's an important point to keep in mind. And I agree with what was said about the volume proposed by the Boston group. But the plan does provide for a clear and straightforward transport, better conditions than one would find in Asia. And that could ultimately provide something around 2 to 3 million. And then I think that political incentives could be put in place so that this can work and the money can flow where it should, through a trust, an ad hoc trust. Thank you so much, Tamara. This really brings us to another reflection from a geopolitical standpoint. What would be the consequences of maintaining the status quo and not doing anything for those that are still still fighting in the country, geopolitically, the U.S.'s adversaries could be gaining more power if nothing happens. I'd like to turn to Francisco again. We've talked about the Boston Group's proposal, but there are also other proposals out there. There's the one that was published in 2019, Francisco Rodriguez's Oil for Venezuela group. We had a very constructive conversation about that. And I would like you to tell us what you find key about this proposal and what you see as the opportunities and challenges politically and technically. Yes, as you say, Francisco Rodriguez and his Oil for Venezuela group have put together a proposal. They studied the Iraq case and they sought to address all the issues that were mentioned in the first panel today. It proposes a structure where there is a management board with representatives both from the opposition and the Maduro regime with the UN presence, and OFAC would authorize exports of Venezuelan petroleum to the US, and the proceeds would go to a fund administered by that management board. And if a joint venture wants to participate in this program, then the investments would also flow through this mechanism. And the pros of this is that it identifies the problems of the Iraqi program and the incentives that different stakeholders need to be engaged. The cons is that the cons are that yes, it is very complex, as was the Iraqi program. So the challenge there, and uh, as we've seen that in the political landscape, it would be really hard to sell something like this. And for that reason, we think it might be more politically viable to start lower with initiatives that are already working and generating trust and starting there. But it's important to point out that the Oil for Venezuela proposal does seek to address the issue of how the funds are used so that the oil proceeds aren't used for graft and corruption. And those aspects of this proposal should be taken into account into any program ultimately applied. Thank you, Francisco, and thank you for being so disciplined and providing a short response. Now let's go to the last questions. Patricia, let's come back to the US. Thinking of the discussions we've had privately, I'd like to hear your perspective. Um, a humanitarian agreement for Venezuela that uses the sale of crude oil to purchase humanitarian assistance would have to be designed and operated within the framework of US sanctions on the Venezuelan oil industry, and where we have the Treasury and State Departments and OFAC involved. And so what is your perspective? What are the possible opportunities? How would you involve the US government in this? What are the opportunities there and what are the obstacles we might find along the way? Well, that's a key question. It's Let's focus on the opportunities. We have to understand that all these humanitarian mechanisms have to be analyzed from different angles. It's clear that we need a solution and we need one quickly. Um, as Tamaro said, it's an urgent crisis. Venezuelans are suffering terribly, but we must understand that the system can offer opportunities, and one is transparency. And I imagine that after listening to the first part, many will be raising their eyebrows and saying, wow, with everything we're hearing about the oil for food program, this doesn't seem right. But let's focus on what's happening today in Venezuela. Oil imports, oil transactions are totally opaque. We don't know what's happening with crude oil in Venezuela. In the month of July, in just one port, 300,000 barrels per day were being exported, and 20% of this were in the hands of unknown companies, recently created companies that nobody knows. So if you had to identify who's the off-taker, who's the buyer, then you gain transparency. Exports would become auditable, which is just not the case right now. And then the issue of transport, where it's headed, all the tankers carrying off Venezuela's crude have their satellite systems turned off, using false names, using ID numbers for tankers that have long been decommissioned. So it's impossible to truly understand where that oil is headed. This kind of system would answer that question clearly. How much oil? Where's it going? And the tankers would have their satellite systems on. So there is great opportunity here. And all the stakeholders mentioned previously should look at it from this perspective. And I'll wrap up. I know we're short on time. But once exports become more transparent and can be audited, that's when you can begin to pave the way for an institutional framework. I mean, PDVSA hasn't publicly presented financial statements. We don't know what's going on, and any small step towards transparency is helpful. Thank you, Patricia. That's really helpful. And there is consensus within the working group that transparency is vital. Any proposed system would have to ensure transparency so that the proceeds couldn't be used for corruption, for social control. That and it is, of course, vital to avoid repeating past mistakes. So, Tamara, here's the last question. Thinking about transparency, institutionalization, opportunities for Venezuela, what would be the role of humanitarian groups on the ground, multilaterals, the petroleum operators themselves? What are some recommendations in terms of safeguards and how to counteract the regime?
I think it's clear that we have to have represented all the affected parties. This is why we need to create a special purpose vehicle where you have everyone there is bulletproof, in a manner of speaking. Therefore, there have to be representatives of all stakeholders, not just representatives of the governments involved, but also representatives of civil society, people with vast experience in humanitarian aid and assistance. I believe the part of the question you asked was answered by Patricia and her response. But I think you have to look at Chevron, Petroviel, and some of those companies more specifically in terms of how urgent the humanitarian program is in fact. So let's focus our sights on that. A company of volume that we talked about, these millions of barrels per day. So the challenge lies in the pre-selection of who will be running this to prevent corruption from off-takers, from the clients. And then we will have a first step forward, know who they are, the exact amounts, and each will have a contract that specifies very clearly what will be collected and what percentage will be devoted to the aid. So instead of leaving it up to chance, make sure that everything is well specified for the mechanism itself. Before we start envisioning vast programs, what we can do is scale up the current programs that exist, and to do so also bearing in mind the pandemic. So Tamarda, Francisco, and Patricia, excellent responses. It's been a wonderful conversation. There's no quick solution. Everything's going to be very complex. This is an unprecedented crisis in Venezuela. At Atlantic Council, we will be fostering discussions about some of the challenges faced by Venezuela, trying to alleviate the crisis that the people of Venezuela are living. They're living in very poor and impoverished conditions. And we are going to continue to work on this and other topics. In fact, next week, we're coming out with a written report about today's discussions. We have a number of different stakeholders providing inputs. Thank you to you all and the network of partners who joined us today. We're going to be producing increasing amounts of content about Venezuela. So we thank you for your interest and your support. Have a great afternoon.